Hi, everybody. I'm Ron Carucci, and it's great to be joining you here from Harvard Business Review Live. We're here to talk about 4 things that set great executives apart. Now, we've known for a couple of decades now that between 50 and 60% of all executives fail within the first 18 months of their assignments. And as staggering as that statistic is, it's become our new normal. Well, that statistic became a little personal for me a few years ago when I got a phone call from a young man who had worked on a very large, complicated transformational project in his company, what my firm had partnered with. And during the project, he had distinguished himself as a great leader, highly influential. He had conveyed great ideas, and people wanted to be around him. So nobody was surprised at the end of the project when he was offered the opportunity to take on a broader assignment for the organization. So 10 months later, when I saw his name in my caller ID, I assumed he was calling to tell me about the great progress he'd made and all the achievements they'd done since the work had ended. Unfortunately, he was calling to tell me he'd been fired and was looking for help getting another job. I was shocked. I barely had time to catch my breath from that phone call. A couple of hours later, the CEO of that company, who'd been our client, also called me to tell me they had to let him go, and quite angrily, more than just inferred that some of the failure was ours for not preparing him well enough for the assignment. Well, I was devastated. I couldn't imagine having done anything that would have contributed to the demise of such an otherwise talented leader. So I asked him, could we come in? Could we come and investigate? Could we find out what could have gone so wrong? How could we have misjudged his potential so grossly? Well, he let us come in. That investigation led us to a 10-year longitudinal study of more than 2,700 executives in more than 50 organizations. We isolated 100 leaders in mid-ascent to see if we could find what were all the landmines they were stepping in, what was causing them to fail and take otherwise very promising leaders out of the game so quickly. Well, that study was pretty staggering. We found out that 61% of those leaders told us that they were not prepared for the jobs they took. And 76% of those leaders told us that their organizations didn't do enough or didn't do anything to prepare them for their jobs. Well, when you've got 2/3 of leaders taking assignments at the top levels of organizations and 3/4 of them feeling like the organization isn't helping them to prepare, it's not hard to see what might be causing such high failure rates. Well, the great news is this. One of the surprising things the data revealed to us was what it was the other 50% of executives were doing to actually succeed. How were they arriving at senior level jobs and thriving once there? Well, the data revealed 4 consistently recurring patterns. No matter how we cut the data up, these 4 capabilities rose to the top as what it was that set those executives apart. So I want to share those with you today. And please, throughout our conversation, post your questions. Let me know what you're thinking about. Let me know what you want to know more about. Love to stop and chat about it. So the first pattern we saw we called breadth. Now, these were the leaders who could take the widest possible view of the organization. They could see how all the pieces fit together. They didn't look at the organization as marketing or sales or logistics. They saw the organization now as product commercialization. They knew where competitive capability came together at the seams of the organization. They knew that it was the integration of those functions that set the organization apart to compete. They couldn't bring their functional biases to the table anymore. So if they rose up through finance, they couldn't see the world through an economic lens. Or if they rose up through marketing, they couldn't see the world through a consumer or economic lens. They had to see the world through an integrated whole. They had to see the organization whose whole was greater than the sum of its parts. Jonathan is a great example. Jonathan headed up innovation for his company, a large consumer products company, who had said for that coming year they wanted 40% of their revenue, top-line revenue, to come from new product introductions. Well, the organization knew that was a pretty lofty goal because their track record of introducing new products was pretty bad. Marketing was highly focused on just generating content, and that's what they were incented for, and they worked on a very strict advertising budget. R&D was heavily focused on quality because their track record of bad products was so high. So with a global footprint and lots of regulatory requirements, they narrowly focused on quality, making them a little bit risk-averse. Consumer Insights very territorially owned the interpretation of the consumer studies. which they tended to have a bad habit of embellishing the positive results of because they never wanted to deliver bad news to their executives. So R&D was making bad decisions on bad data. And manufacturing was very antiquated. They had a very old footprint, so their ability and capacity to manufacture products was very constrained. So Jonathan now has to find some way to bring all these things together. Well, he had a couple of options. He could have run around and been the hub and all the spokes. He could have tried and stitched all these things together, connecting all the dots. But instead, he very wisely brought these leaders together and made them listen to each other through days and days of intense work. He forced them to have hard conversations. He forced them to exchange tough feedback. He forced them to look at data from an honest perspective. And what they uncovered was astounding. They discovered some very broken processes that didn't cross those organizations or connect them. They discovered decision rights that were very unclear. They discovered metrics that were competing. And they discovered really broken relationships that had been impaired because of strained conflicts. But through days and days of work, they found ideas on how to solve those problems. They found ways to work through it. And Jonathan said one of the greatest outcomes of those conversations and that work was how many more leaders had a wider view of the organization, had a more collective and shared perspective of the whole organization. So how is it in your organization? What seams do you need to work better? Where are there border wars or territoriality with other functional partners that you've got to close the gap on? Where are you narrowly seeing the organization and not understanding how your function fits into a broader whole? Get better at those things and you can master breadth. The second pattern we saw in the data we called context. Now, these were the leaders who had deep, deep knowledge of how their industry and their business made money. They could spot the trends coming down the horizon to disrupt their organizations. They could see and anticipate their consumer and customer needs. They paid attention to what was happening outside their organization, but they also paid attention to the tea leaves in the culture. They could read the vibe. They understood what was happening. They never tried to impose their thinking generically. They really read the environment well. Too many executives arrive at top levels of the organizations with an alarming lack of understanding of how their organization competes and wins. If you ask them to deconstruct their P&L, they don't know where the margins come from, and so they have to fake it. They hide behind strategic planning goals. They hide behind other metrics, and they don't really know where their organization fits into a larger story. And sometimes we set those leaders up to fail in the very processes we use to pick them. So in the interview process, we'll say things like, my gosh, look at the supply chains you've turned around. That's what we need. Or, my gosh, look at these great brands you've built. That's what we need. Or, you've built all these sales capabilities all over the world. We need the same thing. Well, in those messages, we send a dangerous message to these leaders that we think they have a success formula that we want them to apply here. So we've seen the movie, right? They come in and they start slapping their recipe onto the organization, and of course, the organization resists. And the harder they push, the more resistance they get. So we train them by telling them they have a track record to ignore context instead of to read the context. Tom was a CEO of a consumer electronics company. He was hired by their board to expressly come in and turn around the company. It had narrowly escaped Chapter 11. It was in a ditch. A lot of change was going to be required. But Tom quickly realized that the culture of this organization was wildly different than anything he'd ever led in before. The way they treated each other, the way they treated information, the way they made decisions, how they thought about customers, all very different values than what he understood. Well, he smartly waited to impose change. He learned to adapt. He isolated the things about that culture that had made it successful once before, the things that were special about it, he preserved. And in so doing, he earned the trust of the organization. He adapted himself in order to impose greater change later. And when he had to do that, he'd earned the credibility to do it. He understood that he had as much to change in himself as he had to change in the environment to know the context. So what context do you need to know more about in your organization? Do you know instinctively what competitors are doing and the moves they might make? Do you understand what disruptive trends may be coming your way? What trends have you denied? What have you said about, oh, that's not going to be an issue for us? How do you read the culture or the subcultures in your enterprise? Can you read the tea leaves? Do you have an intuitive sense of how things work? Get better at those things and you can master context too. The third pattern we saw we called choice. Now, these were the leaders who had an amazing ability to integrate intuition, data, and other voices to construct well-crafted decisions. And they weren't afraid to say no. These leaders knew that they needed to narrow the focus of the organization on a few choices to focus in order to succeed. Too many executives get to senior level spots and they're too afraid to disappoint people, and they dole out way too many yeses to the organization. And in doing that, they dilute the resources, they dilute the focus of the organization, and they institutionalize mediocrity to the organization because everybody's working on way too many things, far more than the organization could ever absorb. Interestingly enough, one of the most surprising things we found in the data was when we isolated the issue of power. So we expected to find the typical abuses of power, ethical and moral failures, and self-interest and self-indulgence. And we did find those. But surprisingly, those were not the greatest abuses of power we found. The greater abuse of power we found was the abandonment of it. Leaders abdicating power in their roles because they were too afraid to exercise and use it. These leaders weren't afraid to disappoint people. They understood that for some great ideas to prevail, even other great ideas had to be forsaken. Marla Smith Nielsen is an executive director of an NGO called Water First in Seattle, an amazing organization that brings water to the developing world, to bring water and clean hygiene to places that don't have access to it, where women are walking kilometers and hours a day to get water. Now, interestingly, it's a very wide sector of organizations, and the vast majority of organizations in the water sector bring very basic well pumps, install the pumps in the communities, and that's access to water. What's been known for a long time, though, is that 35 to 50% of those projects fail in the first 3 years, and they remain unrepaired, which means the community that got access to water has now lost it. Think about the devastation that could cause. Well, Marla wanted to solve this problem, but she knew she couldn't do a widespread set of projects and continue to proliferate just simple pumps. So she's narrowed the focus of Water First to just 4 countries. And in those 4 countries, they partner with local partners. And they have local communities build very sophisticated and high-quality water systems that pump water to the community and even to people's homes. They're responsible to build a governing board to govern the water and govern the fees. They are trained to maintain and repair the systems. Well, very excitingly, after 11 years of existence and hundreds of thousands of people they've served, 100% of their projects remain operational today. That's because they've made hard choices, hard trade-offs, they focus the organization, and they make hard choices. So what decisions are you avoiding? Where do you struggle to use more data? Are you being too trust your gut and too intuitive? Or where do you get analysis paralysis, where you bury yourself in too much data and aren't trusting the voices of others? Or where are you inviting too many people to the table and trying to get fake consensus instead of making a hard call? Where do you need to narrow the resources and focus of your organization so that a few priorities can prevail? Do those things, and you can master choice as well. The last pattern we saw, we called connection. Now, these are the leaders, and we've all seen them, right? These are the people in organizations everybody wants to work for. They're kind, they're smart, they're compelling, they're credible, they have great ideas, and most importantly, you know you're going to learn from them. These are the leaders who solicit feedback from other people, and when they get it, they listen to it, and they act upon it. They intentionally prioritize their stakeholder relationships. They know who in their organization they rely on for success, and they know who relies on them for success. And they invest intentionally in building those relationships. They work hard on a regular basis to ensure the level of trust they need is there for those relationships. And most importantly, they make the success of those people their priority. They put others' agendas on their own agenda. We work with a woman named Beth, who is an amazing doctor and scientist and developer of drugs in the pharma and biopharma world. And beyond the incredible track record she has of developing great medicines, one of the most amazing things about Beth was when she began every conversation with somebody in her office or at a meeting or even in the hallway, she always began with the same question: how can I help? And over time, people understood that she meant it, that when they needed her help, they knew they'd have it. When they needed her advocacy, they knew they'd have it. When they needed her to challenge their point of view, they knew they'd have it. She genuinely cared about other people's success, and people wanted to work with her because they knew they'd learn and grow. How can I help? A really simple question, but clearly sends a message to people around you that their success is your success. So what relationships in your stakeholder community do you need to build more trust with? Where are there relationships that you have impaired trust with, where the quality of the relationship isn't up to the task at hand? Who relies on you for success and you haven't earned their trust? Where are there places where you withheld trust from people because they haven't earned it? Do you know what it is that earns some people's trust? Some people extend and withhold trust based on credibility and competence. Some people withhold trust based on integrity. Some people withhold trust or extend trust based on personality. Everybody's different. Do you know the currencies of trust your stakeholders are trading in, and have you figured out how to earn it? Work on those things. Invest in those relationships, and you can master connection too. Breadth, context, choice, connection. We actually see those things as one thing, not four. They actually work very interdependently. You can't master context unless you have the relationships to do it with. You can't master choice unless you have the breadth of the organization to implement those decisions in. They work together in harmony. And we'd love to tell you more about those. So the book Rising to Power is the book in which we documented our 10-year study. We documented all the landmines we discovered on the way up for leaders to step in. We got to the place where we knew how to document the 4 patterns of what made those leaders successful. So come find it at our website, navolent.com. And what questions do you have? I'd love to take your questions because you can learn them. We have a question.
All right, yes, thank you, Ron. So we're getting a few questions in now, but first we'd like to thank our sponsor, LogMe and Rescue. Now let's take a question, our first question from Angela. And she's asking about basically motivating leaders. So what should you do if you're in an organization as a leader and you find that your goals may conflict with the higher ups?
Yeah, well, gosh, that never happens, right? One of the challenges in incentives and goal systems is that when you feel like you're out of alignment with what the organization's asking you to do, it's very difficult to commit. And so, as hard as it may be, you've got to call the question. You've got to push up. Don't be afraid. Don't just cascade down the misalignment. Push up on your organization and find out and point out the contradictions. Those contradictions are what later lead to major ethical failures. So if there's a disparate look at what one leader's being asked to do over their boss, you've got to call the question. That misalignment only leads to bad results later. Great question. Thanks, Angela.
Great. Another question
another
here.
Question, yeah.
So basically, someone was asking if you could just go into more detail about breadth.
Yeah, sure.
Yep.
So most organizations have the infamous problem of silos. So functions sit alongside each other, and people tend to live in that world, and that's how they see the world. So if they're in sales, they see the world through top-line revenue and quotas. If they're in supply chain, they see the world through efficiencies and processes. But the reality is, the things that make an organization truly competitive and distinct don't exist in any one of those silos. They exist at the intersections of them. So the ability for an organization to truly excel in service is a combination of sales, customer service, consumer research, and it's the integration of those things that truly sets service apart. If an organization is great at cost management, that exists in manufacturing, logistics, supply chain, and all throughout their sourcing process, and maybe even in their pricing. Again, a collection of disciplines. So the seams of the organization have to be linked. You have to be able to see not just the parts, but you have to be able to see the whole and what those things create together. And manage it as if it's one thing. You have to see the whole greater than the sum of the parts. Great question. There's a poll right down there below on your screen there. So we'd love to hear which of these are the challenges for you. Tell us where you might be tripping up more than others, or where you'd like to know more about them. We'd love to find a way to get you some more information on them. Another question?
Yes, we're getting a few results in for the poll, and it looks like context is winning out. So we'll wait a few more minutes and see if other people
not a surprise
have a bit more feedback there. But it looks like context with connection coming in, choice and connection coming in second.
Great. Great.
All right. So let's take another question here. So this one is from Zishem, and he's asking how to win trust when results are delayed and hard choices brew dissent.
Yeah, so great question. It's often easy to assume that hard choices and even disappointing decisions can actually impair trust. But you know what? I've actually seen the opposite. I think people can accept hard choices. What they can't accept is being lied to. So if you delay a hard choice, the organization intuitively knows it. It's if you're honest and transparent about why you're making the hard choice and what the trade-offs are. Every executive lives in a constant world of difficult trade-offs. People can accept that. People are not unwise about that. If you train people to think they're always going to get their way and be happy, and then you have to disappoint them with a hard choice, you will impair trust, but not because of that hard choice, but because of all the lies you told them before. So tell the truth. Be honest about hard choices and ask people to commit. They will.
Another question. This one is in from Kevin, and he's asking, I'm the owner of the business, and connections are difficult when they see me as an outsider in their market and don't truly work with me. How can I break this cycle? So another basically question about gaining trust.
Yeah, great question. So Kevin, one of the challenges about owners of the business is, so I'm not sure if you are the founder or not, but people at the top of the organization is a very isolated role, right? And so your people aren't sure if you're safe to get close to. They're not sure if outside you're credible or not. And so the thing I would first tell you to do is to really sit down and say, okay, who are the 5 or 10 relationships across the organization, inside and outside, whose success you can most contribute to, whose influence you most have, and really think about what they need from you, how you can contribute to their success. Go ask them, I want to make our connection stronger. How can I do that? Don't sit and wonder and try and do it in your head. Sit right in front of them and say, this relationship's important to me. I think it's important to both of us. I want to get better at it. Tell me what I can do to make you more successful. What are you working on that I can support? Simply ask the question, and you might not like the answer you get, but they'll give you an answer. Any more questions?
Yep. So this one is from, Robert. And
hi, Robert.
He is asking, how can we better select org leaders for these strengths? Is there a diagnostic tool you'd suggest to spot the best bets for talent in these areas? What traits are you scanning for?
Thanks. Great question. So in the book, at the end of the chapters of each of these 4 sections, we list 10 behavioral indicators that would tell you that you can select for them. Here's the great news about them. So one of the things that was a little intimidating in the findings was the leaders that excelled did all 4 of them well. I didn't want to have to say that, but the truth of the matter was they did all 4 of them well. The great news is you can learn them. You shouldn't wait till your first vice president job to start learning them, but you can learn them if you start early enough in your career. So what I'd love for organizations to do is a better job selecting and testing for these, but what I really love for leaders to do is build organizations that create leaders like this. So work the seams of the organization. Build a governance structure that allows people to participate in decision making. Every organization has an underground, right? It's the underground network. When you're new to the organization, you can't really find out where those are. Work the underground network to build connections. And bring in data from the outside. Bring in outside voices. Bring in contradicting data. Force people outside the organization to look at the organization from the outside in to learn context. Do things that actually cultivate these leaders so that when you select for them, you'll actually find them. Any other questions? Awesome.
Another question here is from Richard, and he's
Richard.
asking, how do you deal with employees who find it very difficult to connect with the organization's mission and vision?
Well, I'd ask a couple of questions first. One, I'd say, how clear are the mission and vision? And I don't mean how well are they written on the wall, because we all know how to write them on the wall. Mission statements and vision statements are different than visions and missions, right? A mission is really a purpose we all understand. So the first thing I want to know is it clear? Has everybody done the work, once the vision and mission were written, to understand how their jobs contribute to that mission? Have you done the work to create a very clear line of sight between everybody's daily duties and how it contributes to that overall mission? So if you haven't done that work, that's your first order of battle. But it could be that people's personal values or personal aspirations or their talents really are misaligned with the vision. The dangerous thing about those people is that they don't quit and leave, they quit and stay. And when they do that, you now have dead wood. So I would definitely work to make sure that people who truly, in their heart of hearts, don't connect with the mission probably should be invited to go find a place that is more suited for them. Again, we have a poll right down below you. So go ahead and check off the boxes. Let us know which of these 4 dimensions you'd like more information about or you struggle with. Which are the ones that you've seen trip you or your boss up?
All right, just a quick update on the results for the poll.
Oh, yeah.
So it looks like we have 33%, it's a tie. Context and connection are now tied. And then 17% breadth and choice.
Great. Well, here's what's interesting in the patterns of failure. So you can fail. So that was the hard part of the data, is if you could be great at 3 of these and not good at one of them, and that could still cause a failure rate. Connection causes the fastest failure. So your failure to connect, especially with peers and direct reports, will derail you the quickest, second closest to connecting with bosses. And context is a quick failure. So I'm not surprised at those results, because failure to read the external environment, failure to read the right data, failure to make set priorities based in relevant context, those are the quickest failures. So that's the, if it's a 12 to 18 month failure rate, those can happen in the first 6 months. Breadth and choice can be a delayed failure. So if your organization stinks at decision making and the governance is very unclear, if you stink at decision making, you're not going to be noticed that much. If the organization is very siloed and very individually focused and very fragmented, your ability to work breadth won't be noticed as much. So depending on your organization and where its dysfunctions are, where its challenges are, can make breadth and choice a little bit of a delayed failure problem. So my guess is that part of what you're all seeing is the faster failure rates of, hopefully not you, but others in your organization with those 2 dimensions. One more question?
Yeah, we'll take maybe 2 more.
Great,
Two
2
more
more
questions. All right, so this
3
one's
more.
from Heath, and he's asking, what if the motto of your leadership is sink or swim? How can you express your concern that this is not the best way to approach?
Oh gosh. Don't you have to wonder, like, somebody sat in a room and thought that was a good idea? Yeah, so you're asking for a very Darwinian dog-eat-dog culture. You're asking for hyper-individualism. You're asking for, my success at the expense of yours. It's a terrible motto. And my guess is that it wouldn't be too hard to point around the organization to see how people's bad behavior is compromising the results. Well, I can't imagine, what the dangerous thing in that situation, Kevin, would be that if the market's rewarding you for some reason, if you're getting some results, and they somehow connect the results to that behavior, it's not sustainable. So even if you're getting a little wind at your back, it's not because of that motto, and it's certainly not going to be sustainable. Over years, you're going to churn through people like a revolving door. So get in their face in some way. If you have to do it anonymously, find some way to show them that that is not a culture they want. So, another question.
Yeah, why don't we end on this question? So this one's from Robert, and he's asking, if these are trainable competencies, the 4 that you mentioned, how and how long should these capacities be trained, given you mentioned they could be cultivated? Mm-hmm. Is there a common initial department area you often find successful leaders are trained, from supply chain, customer service, new product development, mergers and acquisitions, that you would recommend?
Robert, love the question. So the first thing I'd say is from the time they're individual contributors on. So the first thing I find is that people who are mobility, so people who take assignments across a variety of departments, and there are some companies that do a great job of intentionally moving people around, develop breadth the quickest. People who work strategy, who have to really think about external context, tend to learn context great. Unfortunately, choice is often impaired because too many organizations don't design their governance structures to include a wide range of participation in decisions. But the more you can teach people how to use information, how to include others, how to make good decisions, the more they're prepared for more complicated decisions later. So even at the first-line supervisor level, you can start building these muscles. And of course, connection, basic relationship skills, basic listening skills, basic empathy skills. The really fundamentals of what it means to connect with other human beings can begin at the minute an employee walks in your door. Your organization has a norm for relationships. It might not be a healthy one, but there is a way relationships are formed in your organization. If there's something about that contradicts deep trust-based relationships, then you got to fix the systemic issue first, so that as you invite people to participate in great relationships, the organization actually reinforces it. Well, gosh, thanks all you for joining us today. It was great to talk to you. You can find us at www.navalent.com. That's there on your website as well. You can find the research on the book, Rising to Power. You can find, there's a free executive summary of the book you can download. We also have a free ebook on leading transformation in organizations, give you our look at how these transformational journeys actually can play out. You can find me at Twitter at Ron Carucci. I'd love to stay in touch and keep talking. Thanks so much for joining us today. You take good care.